Hello and welcome to yet another great episode of This Week in Christian History. And we are going to have an absolutely fantastic episode today to learn some truth and as well as maybe the full story that you may or may not have ever heard on exactly who was St. Patrick. Was he a real guy? Was it a real thing? Is he a shamrock and snake guy, or is he really a a saint? What is that all about? So we're very pleased to have Dr. Elva Johnston be with us. She is an associate professor of history at University College in Dublin. And so who better to talk about St. Patrick than an Irish scholar from Ireland? So how great for that. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you for asking me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
So maybe just kind of really quickly on the front end, what was St. Patrick a real guy? I mean, was that
Yeah.
a real person and was he really a saint?
So Patrick was a real guy, definitely. And we can say quite a lot about him because he wrote
Mhm.
about himself. So that's really important for us. Was he a saint? Well, I suppose I'll let that up to you to decide, but he was venerated by his followers as a saint. He was seen as a really foundational saint by Irish people over many, many centuries. And then in the 17th century, he was officially put into the Vatican calendar. And so his feast day is sort of a recognized feast day
Right. And so is
On
that
March the 17th.
right? And that's his death date in
That's his death
461,
date.
right?
Yeah, so the we don't know exactly when he lived. So it was in the second half of the fifth century. Like there's lots of clues, context clues. One thing we are certain about though is that his death day was on March the 17th. And the reason for that is that early communities, they believed that when somebody they regarded as really saintly died, really holy, that the day that they died was the feast of them entering heaven. And so
Mm.
it's the one day they mightn't preserve a year, but they'll preserve a feast day. So 17th of March is like 100% genuine.
How about that? Well, tell us about these two versions of St. Patrick. Let's talk about his actual, missionary work, his saint work, his work in the church, and then maybe we could talk about the legends and where those came from.
Yeah, I always think of Patrick as being almost two different people. So there's a real historical Patrick who wrote two documents that survive. I mean, he might have written more, but we have two that survive, that are genuine, that they're written by him. And he tells us a lot about who he is, his spirituality, his mission of conversion. So they're really interiorized, they're interesting. He's somebody who both struggles with, I suppose, his identity, but is also really proud of his development as a Christian. And then there's another figure who was invented effectively by Irish writers in the seventh century, so maybe a century and a half after the time of Patrick. And what happened basically was they were writing for a really important church called Armagh, which is in Northern Ireland now. And Armagh was a very rich, was a very successful church, and they looked back to Patrick as the Apostle of Ireland, and they wanted to link him with them. But they looked at the
Mm.
real Patrick and they read somebody who was really open about his flaws and really open about his struggles with faith and with the challenges that he faced. And they found that maybe a bit challenging. And so they
Mm.
replaced him with somebody who is sort of, he's all conquering. He defeats druids. He's sort of more like a Marvel superhero than he is like a Christian saint. And, the shamrocks, the snakes, all of that goes back to this tradition of reinvention of Patrick. So there's a real Patrick who's an absolutely fascinating figure and a real window into the fifth century, early Christian spirituality. And then he gets overwritten for really political reasons by this, I think, much less interesting but very, very successful reinvention.
Wow. Well, let's talk about his true story from what we know about. So, I
Yeah.
mean, just as a scholar, though, Dr. Johnston, that have people that would actually to be able to have a manuscript, to be able to have something that was written by somebody in their first hand, right? Or that in an autobiographical way or some way to be able to know this is this person's story. What a fantastic, wonderful resource to have, right? I mean, just
It is absolutely amazing. So we don't have it in Patrick's own hand, but we do have early copies.
okay.
And in the 17th century, and this is sort of, I think, sort of an interesting backstory to how we know about Patrick's writings. They sort of emerged as being really important during the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, and different churchmen from different traditions were looking back to the early church, trying to identify figures that really resonated with them, and both members of I suppose the Church of Ireland, or it would be the Episcopalian Church, I suppose, in a US context, and Catholics, they both look back to Patrick, and Presbyterians did as well, and they saw somebody who resonated with them. So finding who he was, finding the
Mhm.
manuscripts, finding out the history actually goes back to then. And that was a real changing point in which people were going, okay, let's see who was the original guy. What was he like? What did he believe? Is he somebody that we can look to in, almost as an inspiration? And there was enough in his biography that they were going, okay, yes, this guy he's fascinating. He's somebody who really speaks about finding faith in the most difficult of circumstances and
Mhm.
how you live that faith. And how do you do that through your life? How do you do it through your mission? So he's a figure that in a way resonated with people over 1,000 years later than those only 150 years after him. It's one of those ironies of history, I suppose, that sort of rediscovery of him during the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, was a rediscovery of the original voice.
Wow, how fantastic. Well, tell us about him then. Give us a good biographical sketch. I mean, was he born Irish? Did he start in Ireland, or had he come to Ireland as a mission, or how did he get there, and how did he grow in this particular story?
So yeah, those are really great questions. I suppose the first thing that I should say is, even though Pat, Paddy, Patrick are really common names for Irish people. And
Mhm.
you even get the term Paddy being used for Irish people in general. Patrick is not Irish. So Patrick is what we would technically call, I'm just going to give you a bit of a technical bit here and then I'll explain it
Sure,
properly.
fantastic.
He's what we would call a Romano-Briton. Okay. So what we mean by that is somebody who, grew up in Britain, probably in Western Britain, who looked back to the Roman heritage, to the old Roman Empire, but would probably ethnically have been Celtic. So he would have natively spoken a language, maybe a bit like what becomes Welsh, but he would also have spoken Latin as well. So he would see himself as part of that inheritance from the Roman Empire, and he does talk about his sort of Romanness as well. So he describes himself as growing up in a really prosperous background, somewhere. He tells us where he's from, a place called Banavem Tabornii. And if that doesn't trip off the tongue, there's a reason it doesn't. It's because we don't know where it is. Okay. We
Ah,
know from his description of how he's enslaved that it must be somewhere. If you think of a map of Britain now, okay, and if you
mhm,
look at anywhere from Cumbria in northern England down to Cornwall in the west,
mhm,
going through Wales, he could be from any of those regions. So he describes himself as growing up in a small villa. His family have slaves. His father is a town councillor. He has a sort of a civic role. His grandfather is a priest,
mhm.
and which is interesting. And for a lot of modern audiences, I suppose, especially if they're Catholic audiences, they look at that and they go, isn't that a bit odd? How could you be the grandson of a priest? But actually, in that early church, the idea of universal clerical celibacy hadn't really been established. And Patrick just says it by the by. It's clearly nothing scandalous. It's something maybe people would expect. And in some later Irish sources, they actually say, such and such a person is a perfect bishop because they have only one child. So, it gives you a sense that
Sure.
clerical celibacy isn't really embedded. So he describes himself, okay, he's in this prosperous family. He says that he doesn't really know God. His faith isn't important to him. He refers to a sin that he commits when he's 15, And he says, oh, it was in a single hour and a single day. I will leave it to your imaginations. And he then gets captured by Irish raiders when he's 16.
Mm.
And he is, he describes there's a raid on his villa. Some of the household are killed. He's taken as a slave, and then he's effectively trafficked to Ireland. I suppose the context here is that while he would have grown in this like very Roman, sort of educated context, very prosperous, the Ireland of the time would have been quite different. So it wouldn't have been Roman in the same way. The culture would have been a lot more rural. Ireland was divided into lots of different kingdoms. So there would have been, and it's something he refers to himself later. People would have lived in sort of farmsteads, mainly sort of a farming economy. And then he gets taken as a slave to the west of Ireland. So if you have a map of Ireland in front of you and you can see Irish
Mhm.
counties there, he's brought to a county called County Mayo,
Mhm.
and it's near a place called Killala Bay, which is actually the only fjord in Ireland, incidentally.
Oh.
And there's a place he mentioned, it's the only Irish place name he actually specifically refers to where he is as a slave. It's a place called Fog Hill in County Mayo. Okay. And you can look it up, you can Google it, and you can see it probably doesn't look terribly different than it did in
Oh
Patrick's
wow.
time. And, he describes, so he's a 16-year-old, right? He's a 16-year-old who's grown up in great comfort, uh, educated, really well-established family, very influential, I would think. He lands in the west coast of Ireland, and one of the things he talks about is the wind and the rain and the snow. And if you've been to the west coast of Ireland, none of this will come as any surprise. So it has to have been really shocking, and it's clearly very traumatic for him. So he describes his time. He's sort of minding sheep up on the hillsides and in all weathers. And during this, he begins to connect with his faith again, and he connects with God. And he describes how he begins to pray and he hands himself over to God. And then he tells us, and this time is very slippery reading Patrick's writings because he's writing sort of autobiographically. He's probably writing for supporters of his mission in Britain and in Ireland, but he's not writing for us, okay? So he's not telling us all of the details we would love to
Sure.
know. So it seems to be several years anyway pass, and he has a vision. He hears the voice of God telling him now it's his time to leave Ireland and to return to Britain. So he describes himself as traveling across the island, which would not have been an easy thing to do because they don't have motorways. And Ireland of today, if you visit it, it's lots of green fields and it's that very emerald green look. But in Patrick's time, it would have been a lot of woodland, bogland. So it would have been quite a trek to go from the west coast to the east coast. And he manages to find probably a merchant ship to take him back to Britain. So he returns to Britain, returns to his family, who are overjoyed, obviously, to see him again. Interestingly, he never mentions any siblings, and I think it's fairly clear he's probably an only child.
Oh wow. Okay.
So again, the fact that he'd return to them would be huge, obviously, for them. And then their joy at seeing him is sort of tempered by the fact that he decides to enter the religious life. And this is something they seem to find difficult. I mean, I think they probably imagine him settling down, maybe having a family, all of
Sure.
those types of things. And instead, he's like, no, he wants to continue on into the religious life. So he works to become a priest in Britain. And all of the time, he's motivated. He has a dream in which a messenger comes to him holding a letter, and he opens up this letter, and it's the voice of the Irish. And it said it's the people from where he had been a captive asking him to come and return to save them. And so he's motivated by this vision to return to Ireland. But unfortunately, there's a little wrinkle in the story at this point in that he confesses to a friend this sin that I mentioned earlier when he was 15. And his friend, and it is in confidence, but his friend then tells various other people about it in the British church hierarchy, and then they oppose him going to Ireland. So
Wow. So who knew all of that was a part of that? Hey, we're enjoying our great conversation we're having here with Dr. Elva Johnston to learn more about St. Patrick and his British roots, as well as his desire to return back to Ireland. So that's which even makes the story even more interesting. So the church then, he had, about what age is he about this time? So how long was he in, I guess, this first part of Ireland, his first stay there as a slave, and as this another, he's
it's
about what
very,
age?
yeah, it's very difficult to tell.
Hmm.
Okay, I'll give you my, I suppose, my
Sure.
guesstimate on that. I would think from the way he describes the passage of time in the confession, he's probably around 40, I would say,
Oh,
when he
wow.
eventually does
Okay.
return to Ireland. So I think he's a good amount of time back in Britain. And if you think about the years that it would take to, I suppose, and get the education to go into the priesthood, like one of the things Patrick says a lot is that he's writing, but he finds writing difficult, but he feels he's not maybe as learned or literate as other people. Now
Ah,
there is a good reason for this. He's actually not a bad writer at all, but he has an anxiety around it. Now there is a really good reason for this. So when he's taken as a slave, he's 16. So it's the equivalent of him having done junior high, but not having done sort of senior high, basically. So
ah.
he loses out on a crucial part of his education when he's in Ireland. And so when he returns, he's making up those lost years. And
Mm,
I don't know if this is an experience of lots of people, but I will say myself as an adult, it's actually harder to learn the older, in some ways, those sort of skills when you get older. It can be more difficult to do that.
mhm.
So he spends years, I think, becoming sort of educated enough, joining the priesthood, and he clearly wants his mission to be one that will be supported by people in Britain as well. And I think the fact that he writes probably shows that it is to a certain extent. And I think the church at the time is there's probably pro and anti Patrick factions. So he decides in the end, because the British church do turn against him, a lot of the hierarchy. And he describes he has a series of visions from God, and he's told, actually, you are the chosen person to go to Ireland, so you should
Mm,
go. You're in, and Patrick's defense, and it's a pretty reasonable defense, I think, is that okay, yeah, I did commit a sin. I was really young, I've changed, and I now feel that I'm inspired to go to Ireland on the basis of my experience. And if you think about it, having spent those years in Ireland, he probably had advantages many other missionaries would not have.
sure.
He would have known Irish, for example. He would have been able to speak to people in their own language. How many people were going to listen to a sermon in Latin, for example? Not many then, and not many now, I suppose. But
Right.
he definitely had those types of advantages. So he decides that he will go anyway. And a lot of what he's doing there's two documents that he writes. So I've been mainly talking about the confession, which is the longer of them, and it gives us this biographical detail and tells us his story. But he's telling us his story to say, I suppose, two things. One is this is why I'm in Ireland. Um, this is why I think it's a good thing to go to Ireland and to bring the word of God. And the other is to say, well, actually, I do need a bit of support, guys. I need, because you don't just land in an island, different country and start preaching.
Right.
You have to build up connections. I mean, he already probably has some, obviously, but he'd been a slave. He hadn't been a member of the elite. You have to build up your connections. You have to make alliances with people, some of whom will become Christians, but others won't become Christians. And, you still need to be able to work with them.
Sure.
And in order to do this, he needs to pay his way. And, he tells us an awful lot about, he says, it's a culture in which people pay their way by exchanging gifts, which is really common in, I suppose, pre-monetary economies. The way to think about it is, on important days in the year now, so a birthday, Or, maybe Christmas or Easter, we exchange gifts with each other.
Mm.
But think of a world in which everything works that way. It's all around the exchange of gifts. So you have to be able to produce these gifts. You have to be able to fund your way. And he tells us a lot about how he does that, the practical mechanics of, I'm going from region to region. I'm trying to persuade people to become Christian, but in order to preach, I have to pay off the rulers in that area, or I have to pay for protection when I'm traveling. And so
Mm.
there's clearly some sort of, I think, question coming maybe from Britain, maybe from elements in the British church going, are you profiting from this or are you not? And he's saying, well, no, I actually need this. I need this in order to preach, and I need this in order to travel, and to bring the message of God. So there's lots of really fascinating material there in terms of just, I suppose, the controversies he faces at home, and then the practicalities of what you need to do in order to spread Christianity, in an era where it's not like now where, we have the internet, we're sort of living in a globalized world.
Sure.
We are able to contact this is a world in which travel is slow, word moves really slowly, and building things up from the beginning it's a really slow process.
My gracious. So he's so does he at what time frame in his life is he writing these? Is this towards his end, or is he still kind of writing as a way to show people, hey, look, I'm really doing God's work but I got to have some help to do these things? I mean, where time frame is he in
That's a
his
that's
life?
a that's a really great question. So, when we look at Patrick's writings, in his letter, the second one, he does refer to himself as having become older. And if you look across the two documents, there's maybe a 20 years between the two of them.
Okay.
And in the second one, so in the first one, it's sort of saying, look, these are the reasons I'm in Ireland. This is why my mission is important, and this is how I'm converting people to Christianity. And he's really proud of, obviously, of his successes. The second letter, though, is very different in context. So he's writing in defense of converts of his who have been captured, some of them killed, some captured by a British tyrant, a man named Coroticus. And he writes to him and he wants him to free his followers. And, but he tells us that at this stage, the person he sends as a messenger is a priest who he had taught since childhood. So in that second document, it's Patrick writing after he has established a functioning type of church. He's
Gotcha.
now talking about somebody he has taught from childhood who is his messenger bringing this letter. And so you can see between them, there's the Patrick maybe of his earlier mission,
Hmm.
looking for support, really, I suppose, struggling in Irish secular society to get his message across. And then there's this later Patrick who actually has obviously succeeded quite a lot, but also is writing in a world which is incredibly dangerous. I mean, it's if you think about living in the fifth century, it's a world in which, old certainties have disappeared. So the Roman Empire in the West has disappeared. It's been replaced by, new warlords and kings, people like this Coroticus, for example. It's the era in which a lot of the identities we think of as European come into existence. So the
Hmm.
origins of, places like, say, like France or England, even, these are all places that sort of come into existence as having that identity during this period. So it's a real period of change. And Patrick gives us such a personal insight into that, the dangers of it, kind of the excitement of it as well, and how people communicate, I suppose, across, very different cultural barriers and language barriers. So they're amazing documents. And if I have the opportunity, I'd really recommend there's a brilliant resource that people can access to read Patrick's own writings,
Okay.
translated into really great translation into English, free to read. It's called Confessio, so Confessio.ie. So if you go to confessio.ie, you'll have access and you read through those writings. And I would recommend anybody who is interested in Patrick
Oh,
and the
great.
real historical Patrick to actually read him in his own words because they come across, I think, really, really individually and powerfully. And they bring that world of the fifth century and the dangers of it so alive, I think.
We'll absolutely put that into our notes, our show notes and other things as we put that out. So, do we have any idea why? What is it about the snakes and what is it about the shamrocks? I mean, why those iconic things that are surrounded around him in particular? Why not? Hey, he got rid of all the elephants in Ireland. See, there's no elephants around here anymore, right? I mean, why is it? Because there's just a snake is a snake. I mean, do we have any idea on how that kind of evolved?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So yeah, when you read Patrick, one of the first things you see is there are no snakes and there are no shamrocks and there's not even a hint of them, you know. You couldn't see how snakes and shamrocks would come into the story. The snakes is an interesting one actually. So it seems that by maybe about the maybe seventh or eighth century, it became sort of generally known that unlike other places in Europe, um, Ireland didn't have a native reptile population. Now, there actually is one reptile in Ireland, one native
Okay.
reptile, which is extremely, extremely tiny. It does exist, so it's not like it's completely reptile free.
Okay.
Yeah, and now we know, obviously, we know from modern science that it's because Ireland was during those glaciation periods, Ireland ended up being apart from Europe, so it doesn't have quite the same types of animals, right?
Right.
So, but it became known, and it was sort of something that even in England they were going, why aren't there any reptiles? Why aren't there snakes in Ireland? And an English writer, an English writer named Bede, writes in his in a great text called the Ecclesiastical History of the English Church and People, which is about the
Right.
coming of Christianity actually to England. He actually writes that if you get a snake bite that the cure is to put pieces of Irish manuscripts. I don't advise this, okay? Put pieces of Irish manuscripts into water and then drink that. Um, I don't think it would be a snake bite cure, but that idea of Ireland, and he sort of says this is sort of the sanctity of of Ireland, etc. So somehow this story about Irish manuscripts being a cure for snake bite and no snakes being in Ireland gets attached to Patrick.
Ah,
And I suppose also there is a sort of, and I suppose it's something that they emphasize maybe later on more, that theological idea of the devil being represented by a snake. You see that in a lot of sort of early, medieval Christian iconography. So it's the idea of, Patrick comes and the snakes leave Ireland. So yeah, that seems to be how it comes about. That what is sort of, I suppose in modern terms, what we might describe as a sort of a factoid about Ireland. Hey, they don't have snakes. And why is this becomes a story about Patrick uh,
right.
getting rid of paganism from Ireland. So yeah, it's an
Where you're
interesting
taking two
one.
stories. You're taking a
It
fact that is
yeah
there and then using that as factual. I mean, except for this little
yeah
guy that you're talking about, but and then stretching that into, oh, that would fit into our story very well here. Snake,
absolutely.
devil, Garden of Eden, et cetera, et cetera. Bad, good. He came. Look how great we are now because of Patrick, and he obviously got rid of all
Absolutely,
the
100%. That's how, and you can see why it works really well. Like
Sure,
that is,
sure.
yeah. And I suppose for what it's worth, in sort of the tradition that develops around him as a legendary figure, the way the Irish sources originally tell it, it's more Patrick going to wells and to springs and expelling demons and
Uh,
turning the sort of, let's be honest, whatever was probably happening at the wells and the springs, because they'd be a focus of probably lots of different types of beliefs and turning them towards Christianity. But yeah, the snake really takes off. The shamrock is actually a more difficult one because with the snake, there is a sort of you sort of can see what happens, right?
right.
As you said, they take a fact and then they give it a symbolic meaning and they attach it to Patrick. The earliest reference we have to the shamrock being worn on St. Patrick's Day is actually in the 17th century. So
Mm,
long time after. But the way it's described, it seems a really common practice. So it's obviously earlier than that, but how early is just really, really difficult to know. So it's sort of from the 17th century, you can see the idea of, it being a symbol of Ireland, and a story arises that the shamrock is a symbol of the Trinity.
mhm,
And that this is how, Patrick would be able to teach people about the Trinity by saying, look, there's three people in one God, just like there's three leaves on a shamrock. Okay.
mhm,
But it's definitely something that develops a lot later, but it becomes really powerful in terms of the iconography around Patrick. And its link with Patrick is why it gets linked with Ireland as well. So the idea of the shamrock that people would have now, that it's sort of the national symbol of Ireland. Like even when I would have been grown up, it's absolutely everywhere. You'd have your shamrocks on St. Patrick's Day. So it's something which I suppose is a tradition, and it's a tradition which is still, I suppose, an oldish tradition. But
mhm.
yeah, it's look, if somebody discovers a source that's able to date it better, um, that would be absolutely fantastic. And there's still loads more to discover out there as well. Like we don't know everything about the past, and obviously it'd be a bit boring if we did. You wouldn't have room to, speculate or to make
Right,
theories about it. But
right.
yeah, so when it's first mentioned, it's already associated with Patrick and it's
Ah,
really popular. But we don't know how long before that first mention people were using the shamrock. The fact that it's so widespread and popular, it's probably for a while, I would say.
yeah.
But I wouldn't be able to put a pin on that in terms of a date, really.
How about that? How fascinating. Where, so is he buried in Ireland? Do we know where his earthly remains are marked?
That's it. I have to say you're really asking such fantastic questions. This is where is Patrick's body? Okay, so that's a really difficult question. So it seems, I would say, pretty clear that he is originally buried in a place called Downpatrick, which is in northeast Ulster. Okay. There's a
Okay,
really early church there, and it bears his name, obviously, Patrick as well. It's probably a church. I know I'm saying probably because I have to be like an academic historian, but
right.
I'm 99% sure of this. So it's a church he almost certainly founds, has his remains. But in that 7th century period, when the Irish church is beginning to grow and become, I suppose, more institutionalized, the church in Armagh, which isn't that far from Down, the church in Armagh sort of wants to take ownership of the cult of Patrick, but they have a
Mhm.
problem, which is they don't have Patrick's body. And,
Okay,
typically you sort of expect the saint's body to
right.
be in the most important church. And so they invent a story about how Patrick really wants to be buried in Armagh, but an angel stops him and says, stops him and said, "Oh no, you have to be buried in Down instead." And then Patrick is really upset, and he bargains with the angel. And none of this could be further now from the historical Patrick.
Okay,
He
right.
bargains with the angel, and the angel says, "Well, if you agree to be buried in Down, Armagh will always be the most important church in Ireland." So he goes, "Oh well, okay, I'll go with that." And so he ends up being buried in Down. So it's accepted really widely, even by Armagh. That's where he's buried. At some point, and Irish, I suppose, like any history is, it's very chaotic. Things get lost,
Mm,
and you know Patrick's, where it is, where the relics go to become lost. You end up with claims for relics in Lisbon, for example, claims for relics in Glastonbury. And I suppose the reality is we just don't know anymore. So between now and then, like what I can say is in the 7th century, he is definitely buried in Downpatrick. There is a body there, right? Even 1,000 years later, I don't know where that body has disappeared too. And you have to sort of think of, I mean, it's a similar thing with another Irish saint, Bridget. There's a body there in the seventh
Mhm.
century. Where that ended up, we have no idea now. So it's just the way history happens sometimes. You lose sight, you lose sight of a body, you lose sight of a manuscript, and it doesn't resurface. And
Wow.
you're left speculating. But yeah, I
Well,
mean, in down, that's what if I had to nail my colors to the mast, I'd say yeah, he was originally buried in Downpatrick. And at
and
some
I'm I'm
point
I'm
it got lost.
guessing, are there shrines and places, and certainly the people at the church there want to make sure you know
Oh,
that this is
they
where we think
absolutely,
he
yeah,
is,
they,
or
oh no, they 100% do. I
yeah.
mean, I actually relatively recently, I did a piece for them in Downpatrick,
Ah,
related to, yeah, the Patrick and his connection with Downpatrick, which, it sort of gets a bit lost because people think a lot of Armagh, or then they're thinking of the national saint and, the St. Patrick's Day. So the idea that he might have died in this small little place in the northeast of Ireland just sort of disappears.
wow. Well, outside of the U.S., other than being in Ireland itself, just because of our large Irish immigration that we know that happened in the 1800s in particular, right? That came. Are there other countries and places that you know of off the? And I may be putting you on the spot. I don't know, but where else does anybody wear green for the day and afraid they're going to get pinched and go find some green beer and be able to? Where else do they do that anywhere besides Ireland
Yeah.
and the U.S.? Do you know?
Well, one thing I sort of say to begin with is the sort of the modern St. Patrick's Day, as you said, with the beer and so on. I think of that as almost being a reimportation into Ireland from the US. So a
Hmm.
lot of the pageantry around it now has
Right.
been, it's a two-way relationship, I think, between Ireland and sort of Irish America in terms of how St. Patrick's Day comes to be celebrated. Yeah, very important in the UK for exactly the same reasons, actually, as in the US. You have a large immigrant population who look back to their Irishness by celebrating St. Patrick's Day. Um, Australia would be another place. So
Oh,
any
okay.
place that you find large Irish immigrant populations, you find St. Patrick's Day being celebrated. And this is something that's been done for a very long time. The very first reference we have to St. Patrick's Day being celebrated is actually a life that is from the continent, where there's an Irish community in this church. In a place called Nivelle. There's a small Irish community and they celebrate St. Patrick's Day. So we
Ah,
know that, from the Middle Ages, Irish people, wherever they've gone, have brought the feast day of Patrick with them and have celebrated it. So it's in a great tradition.
yeah.
Where would we be without St. Patrick's Day? Like when I was growing up, one of the big, I suppose, selling points of St. Patrick's Day is that it usually occurs, it occurs maybe midway through Lent, depending on, where
Right.
Easter lands. And it was a day in which you were allowed to take a relaxation from your Lenten promises. So
Ah.
it's like when I was a child, it's like giving up chocolate, okay, something like that. You could have your chocolate on St. Patrick's Day.
Even another great reason to celebrate. But let there be no question that St. Patrick is Ireland's guy. Okay, no matter where you go, no matter where that fits, you get to claim him, right? I mean, so that's and in spades as well. That's fantastic. Dr. Elva Johnston, we are so grateful for you to give us this insight. What a fascinating look and interest to know about a figure from Christian history that is certainly famous at a different level than maybe others, and other not only saints but other people who are a part of Christian history, and to know how all that fits. We really appreciate you taking time to do this with us.
Oh, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about a topic which I suppose is very close to my heart.
No doubt, no doubt. Fantastic. Well, for those of you who are no doubt watching this video at this point in time, remember to follow us back on all of our social media pieces. Go back to our website at the Center for Christian History.com, and you can sign up for our newsletter and learn about more episodes that are coming from our podcast, as well as our Christian History Chronicles, where we do some greater, bigger, deeper dives into more parts of Christian history to help us learn more, to know more, and understand that there are a lot of smart people that have looked at this and we want to tap into their brains. So, Dr. Johnston, thank you again. We appreciate it.
And thank you. Thank you. It's been great to have this conversation.